and welcome to this recorded lecture in lieu of our regular class lecture today so that we can stay on track while still participating in that excellent opportunity to test the placement system that we use here at CBC. So here is the lecture we would have been doing in class, except now you get to do it at the luxury of your own time in your own home. This PowerPoint is posted up on Canvas as well if you want to peruse it at your own leisure without having to watch the entire video and listen to me drone on. But we're going to be talking about literary analysis and close reading strategies so that we can really dig into the text. Of course, you've already started reading Murder on the Orient Express. You've got through chapters 1 through 5 if we're staying up to date with the calendar. And now we get to read through chapters 6 through 8 over the weekend. We get to answer some discussion questions. But in order to really get into that kind of information, we need to be able to read deeply into the text to find theme, to find motif, to find excellent quotes we may want to use for an essay later on. So this is designed to equip you with the tools you need to be successful as we move through this project and as we start to develop our essays. All right, literary analysis. It's always important to define our terms before we really begin working with them in an academic context. So literary analysis, in a nutshell, is when you read a work of literature in an English class and you're asked to analyze it. You're asked to read it in a special way. We're performing something called literary analysis. To analyze means to break something down into smaller parts and then examine how all of those parts work together, both individually and as a cohesive whole. Literary analysis involves examining all the parts of a text, whether it's a play or a novel, a short story, or a poem. These elements involve things like character, setting, tone, and imagery, just to name a few. So thinking about how the author uses these elements to create certain effects really deepens our understanding of the text and allows us to engage with it in a whole new way. So if we're defining what literary analysis is, sometimes it's also helpful to look at what literary analysis is not. Literary analysis isn't a book review. This is something that's a very, very common mistake for folks to make, is that they think literary analysis just means I liked the book, here are the reasons why I liked the book, or I hated the book, and here's why. That's not what we're asked to do here. Book reviews are great in elementary school and middle school and maybe the beginning of high school. But now that we've reached college level academic discourse and composition, that was the word I wanted. The baby was up a lot last night, so coffee and tea are wonderful. Composition, the word I wanted. So when you're working in college level composition, we're really trying to take our writing and our critical thinking to the next level, and literary analysis helps us do that. So we're not writing a book review. I don't really care whether you liked the book or hated the book. Of course, I want you to like the book. But that's not the point of the essay. It doesn't matter if you liked it or not. We just care about whether you're able to conduct analysis. And so literary analysis also isn't summary. We're reacting to the text, we're examining the text, but we're not solely summarizing the text. A college level literary analysis deals with your thinking. It asks, how does this piece of literature actually work? How does it do what it does? Why did the author make the choices she did? And those are much deeper questions, much more interesting questions for us to answer as writers other than, did you like the book? It allows us a lot more room to grow and develop our ideas. So how to analyze in 3 easy steps, or a million steps. No, it's just 3. Just 3 steps. So no one is born knowing how to analyze literature, just like no one's born knowing how to write an A-grade essay. It takes practice. Practice makes perfect. So it's just something we've got to do over and over again, which is what we're going to be practicing over the next couple weeks in class with our readings as well. So when we're trying to dig into a text, where we're trying to work with literary analysis, we want to do 3 primary things. We want to ask questions, we want to collect evidence, and we want to develop and organize arguments. Theoretically, if there was ever an extra credit quiz that came up in class on a low attendance day, these 3 easy steps might make an appearance. So it wouldn't be a bad idea to just jot them down in your notebooks real quick. All right, so the first step, asking questions. We really want to ask good questions as opposed to just any old question. So good questions don't have yes or no answers. They ask the reader to think deeply. They ask the reader to look through the text and find quotes and different examples to support their ideas. So a good question, if you're reading Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, which I would argue is one of his worst plays. I mean, come on, they're babies. They're fresh out of middle school, falling in love, and then committing suicide. It's messed up. Many of his other plays are great, though. I love Shakespeare, just not Romeo and Juliet. So some good questions. Are Romeo and Juliet's parents responsible for the deaths of the children? This is something that forces the reader to dig a little bit more deeply in the text. You've got to look through, you've got to find evidence and support, and it's a much more interesting question than what happens at the end of the book, you know? So we want to have good questions that cause some critical thinking. If you've read Lord of the Flies, which is a mandatory reader in a lot of the high schools, why do pigs keep showing up in Lord of the Flies? It's weird. They're on an island with not a lot of other living things, but inexplicably there are pigs all over the island. Why do we think that might be the case? Is it a symbol for something? Does it build into the theme? That's something that is an interesting question that causes us to read more closely. Another one, if you had to read Frankenstein, it's almost Halloween, so it seems appropriate. If you read about Frankenstein in high school, a good question would be, are Dr. Frankenstein and his monster alike? And if so, how? This makes us dig a little bit more deeply because one is clearly a monster and the other is a scientist, but one could argue the scientist is also filled with some monster-like qualities. So you can get some really good answers, some really solid critical thinking when you ask good questions. Of course, if that's true, the flip side is also true. If you ask bad questions, there's not a lot of room for us to grow. So a bad question, if you had to read To Kill a Mockingbird, which is a fabulous book, and if you haven't read it, you really should. I named my dogs after it. That's how much I love it. But a bad question about that book would be, what happens to Scout in To Kill a Mockingbird? This has a right answer. You can look on SparkNotes and read through the summary and be like, Scout learns a lesson about racial prejudice and justice and how to treat people kindly. And nobody's going to argue that. You're going to be like, yes, because that's what happened in the book. We want questions that can be argued. We want different perspectives and different points of view. Another example of a bad question, another Shakespeare play. What do the other characters in Julius Caesar think about Caesar? They don't like him. They stab him in the back, literally, with a bunch of knives. So that's not a good question. It has an easy answer. We can just pull out of the text. Nobody's going to argue that with you. They loved him, and that's why they stabbed him, right? Not really a thing. And the final one, we don't want to make the questions too weirdly personal. So how does Hester Prynne in The Scarlet Letter remind me of my sister? Nobody's probably really interested in the answer to that except for you. And if you read The Scarlet Letter, you will notice that there's a little bit of humor in that question because Hester Prynne got a big old A written on her chest for adultery and sleeping around. So this was just a pretend question. Does not remind me of my sister. But if that was in fact the case, we wouldn't want that to be a guiding question for an essay because nobody cares except for you because nobody else knows your sister. So we want good questions, questions that make us dig deeply into the text, questions that are arguable, and questions that don't have simple yes or no answers. We also want to collect evidence. And evidence in fiction can be broken down into two categories. There's elements of story and elements of style. And so you can take some time to read through this PowerPoint slide. It will walk you through the different elements of story. There's plot. That's what happens in the novel. There's characters. Those are the people in the novel. Conflict is the big tension, the big action that's happening. In our book, it's murder. Setting is where this takes place in our book. That's on a train. The narrator is the person telling the story. We kind of have an omniscient narrator here, so we get a lot of perspective on characters. Sometimes the narration shifts to Poirot's perspective, which then narrows our ability to see what other characters are thinking, and that's important. And then themes, we talked about Monday, and text the main ideas or messages in the work itself. So if there's elements of story we talked about, there are also elements of style. This is structure and organization. How is this book put together? How do the chapters evolve? Are we in a linear timeline, or do we jump around with flashbacks? How does this book work in a timeline? Point of view is also really important because it tells us how much we actually know. Point of view, of course, is colored by the character who's giving us the story. So Poirot has a very clear perspective that would be very different than Ratchet's perspective, or very different than Monsieur Bach's perspective. So the point of view, whoever gets to tell the story, gets to show us through their eyes what's happening. So sometimes that point of view can be unreliable. So take everything you read with a grain of salt. Not everybody is always truthful in this novel when they're talking about their stories. Diction is important. That's all about word choice. What kind of language are the characters using? The princess uses very different language than the Italian in this book. And so it helps us understand the characters more when we look at how they use words. And syntax is word order. You'll notice as we're reading through the book, we get to the Swedish lady. She has a hard time speaking English, and so her syntax is very different, and that helps us kind of hear her voice as well as read her ideas. Tone is the mood or feeling of the text. This book can be very playful. It also has some very dark moments. So pay attention to the emotions that you experience as you read through as well, because those are very intentionally placed into the novel. Imagery is also important. We talked about this on Monday. I think Agatha Christie does an amazing job at imagery, because in that short paragraph we read where she talked about Poirot, you could really picture this short little egg-headed man with a curly mustache and just the little tip of his nose sticking out from underneath his scarf, who was so OCD that he'd rather be shot than have dirt on his coat. That tells us a lot about this character. So the imagery is fabulous here, as is the use of figurative language. So be on the lookout for metaphors and similes as we go through the book. Agatha Christie is fabulous as she goes through those as well. We also want to develop and organize arguments. We're going to spend more time with this as we get closer to the essay, because developing and organizing arguments is the essay. But we want to make sure that everything we say can be backed up by the novel. So that's why as we read, we want to make sure we're highlighting, writing notes in the margins, and paying attention to how different elements come together. So close reading strategies, we want to observe facts and details about the text, and we want to interpret those observations. And so you can take time to read through this slide, but really in a nutshell, we want to be engaged in the reading. We don't want to be skimming while the TV's on, and we're also listening to the latest podcast on our phone, and the dogs are running amok in the house, and children are going which way. We want to be able to focus on the reading. And so try and set yourself up so you have an environment so you can really get into the story. So some methods for close reading. Read with a pencil in your hand. Feel free to make notes. It's not sacrilege for this book to write in the margin. So please feel free to write down your ideas, write down your thoughts, write down your reactions as we go through here. And look for patterns, things that you've noticed that are similar. If there's repetition or contradictions, those can be very telling as we move forward. And we also want to ask questions, and that's where we want to have those critical questions that help us understand the text more fully. And one of the ways that we look at that is the idea of foreshadowing. This is a literary device in which a writer gives a hint of what's to come later. So as you're reading through this book, and we look at chapter 1, and Poirot is standing on the platform talking to the guard. And on page 11, if you've got this version of the book, he's talking to the guy, and he's saying that the weather has been kind of cold, and the lieutenant says, "Let us hope you'll not be snowed in up in the Taurus." You're like, why would you say that? That's like a Murphy's Law thing to say, knock on wood, because of course, now that you said it out loud, we're going to get snowed in. That's an example of foreshadowing. Another example, when Poirot is talking with Arbuthnot, he's listening in on another conversation, and Arbuthnot is talking and says something along the lines of, "I wish to heaven we were out of all of this." Like, out of all of what? It makes us curious and foreshadows that there's going to be some more complex stuff ahead. I'm just about out of time on this recording, so we'll continue this on part 2.